on väikeste moodulreaktorite tuleviku roll kogu maailmas. Mul on väga hea meel sõna üle anda ettevõtjale, kelle fookus on juba tükk aega olnud nii kliima kui keskkonnateemadel. And so it is my great pleasure to ask Bret Kugelmass to come to stage and share with us his vision on what is the role of small modular reactors and how they can change the world. Bret, you have our undivided attention.
Tere hommikust, kallid eestlased! Mul on väga hea meel siin olla.
You know, I first became familiar with Estonian entrepreneurship through reading about the digital leap and, of course, Skype. But when I met Henry and Kalev in person and got to see their enthusiasm, their energy, I've never been more excited to fly halfway around the world to really get to know what this country's all about. My background comes from climate change. I learned about nuclear energy as an outsider looking in. Similar to the journey that this country is about to go on as well. So with my remarks today, I'll take my head start and share with you what I've learned. Atomic energy. It is amazing when you learn about the physics, but a little bit depressing when you learn about the economics. Why is this? How is it possible? A fuel that is more abundant than coal or oil, and yet for the last 50 years, it can barely compete in the market? Why has building a new plant become so hard? What has the industry done wrong to squander a 6 order of magnitude advantage? And will we take the right steps to fix it? Or are we destined to make the same mistakes with a new flavor each generation? Too often I hear from nuclear advocates that nuclear is part of the solution. This statement demonstrates an uninspired lack of confidence, and it contradicts both mathematics and common sense. First, the math. When it comes to climate change, it is not enough to eliminate all carbon emissions across the globe in every single sector. In order to stop continued heat and temperature rise, we must remove the last 2 centuries of previous emissions as well. It is the trillion tons of greenhouse gas that we have already emitted that is currently warming the globe at a rate of 3 watts per square meter radiative forcing. Even if we got to 0 new emissions, Earth would not stay at this magnitude of temperature increase. The Earth would continue to warm at this rate of temperature increase. That's a big difference. That means that not every low-carbon energy source is created equal. The challenge of climate change is to capture carbon, ideally turn it into something useful. But this, by definition, requires a lot of energy, a lot of it. Energy to move and transform 1 trillion tons of CO2, plus any additional emissions that you create in trying to power that cleanup. And that's the problem, since every energy source has a carbon footprint. Even in trying to remove carbon, it is possible to make the problem worse. It's like trying to pay off a debt by borrowing money. The reason why only nuclear will save the world is that only nuclear, when powering the capture of CO2, can remove more carbon than it releases in trying to do so. And now the common sense part. Nuclear so clearly stands apart. When you use the force inside of an atom instead of the force between atoms, you receive 1,000,000 times as much energy, which means for the same output, you are using 1,000,000 times less input. That's 1,000,000 times less material dug from the earth, 1,000,000 times less chemicals used to make that material useful, 1,000,000 times less land, 1,000,000 times less environmental damage. Historically, we haven't heard this argument very much in the public discussion. But any environmentalist who continues to stand in the way of nuclear is engaging in the same behavior as climate deniers. They're turning a blind eye to science in favor of a story that supports their beliefs. But just in the last year, I've started to see this change. The intellectuals and decision makers of the world are beginning to champion nuclear's environmental value. True leaders are emerging who understand that Mother Nature doesn't care if we feel green. Our nuclear representatives thus far have projected weakness. If we want to succeed, we need a new breed of entrepreneur. If you want to clean the air, if you want to solve climate change, if you want to sell nuclear, nuclear is not part of the solution. Nuclear is the solution. Earlier I mentioned the importance of not repeating our mistakes. Since we are here to talk about small reactors, let us first discuss why are reactors large to begin with. When Westinghouse sought approval of the AP1000, it cost them $1 billion in regulatory fees. Not because there was a significant difference in hazard that needed to be reevaluated, but because it was the regulator's right to do so. When Areva sought approval of the EPR, it cost them $1 billion in regulatory fees. Not because of a difference, but because it was the regulator's right to do so. When GE sought approval of the ESBWR, it cost them $1 billion in regulatory fees. Not because of a difference, but because it was the regulator's right to do so. NuScale so far has spent $500 million and counting. Smaller may mean simpler. Smaller may mean lower consequence. But small does not guarantee regulatory restraint. On top of that $1 billion in just reviewing specifications, regulators then required each reactor to add $9 billion in extra equipment and construction costs and $200 million per year in unnecessary operational costs to make the original water reactors, which were never a public hazard to begin with, safer. The reason reactors are large isn't because no one thought to make them small in the last 50 years. The reason reactors are large is that you need to sell a lot of energy to pay back a $10 billion loan. The reason reactors are large is that no company and no country has resisted regulatory overreach. There has never been a cost-effective deployment of nuclear energy in all of human history when the regulator has had independent, unrestrained authority. Estonia, in the next 10 minutes, I will make my case why, if you follow the current paradigm of nuclear regulations, if you relinquish your sovereign right of review and trust a gold standard regulator, you are guaranteed that you will never have a nuclear plant built on Estonian soil. That may sound like a radical statement, but ironically, it is the current leadership of these gold standard regulators who agree with me the most. This is why they all talk of trying to transform their organizations, every single one of them. Because over the last 50 years, they've become culturally incompatible with approving designs. These organizations have not been designed to regulate for net public benefit. They've been designed to minimize the probability of radiation release at all costs. And the cost has been clean air, the cost has been clean water, the cost has been public safety. The notion that radiation release, no matter how small, creates a hazard is absurd. Watch this. I just released 1.2 billion radioactive carbon-14 atoms. Yet, none of you got up and ran away. According to the current radiation paradigm, I just increased the risk of cancer for every single person in this room. According to the current radiation paradigm, when 50% of you eventually do get cancer, I'm partially responsible. This is what is meant by adhering to the linear no threshold model. It says no threshold. According to the current radiation paradigm, I should not be allowed to breathe. And that is what has happened to the nuclear industry over the last 50 years. And everyone knows what happens when you are not allowed to breathe. Nuclear is special, but radiation is not a special hazard. Radiation is like any other toxin. If it can move through the environment and accumulate in human biology past a certain threshold, only then is there a threat of public concern. And there is only one isotope that comes out of a reactor that has both of those properties. That it can move and accumulate. And that is iodine-131, which only lasts for 2 months. We can narrow the hazard to this one isotope as an indisputable result of an epidemiological analysis of Chernobyl, where 30 years later, there were 0 birth defects, 0 leukemias, nothing but thyroid cancer from iodine-131. Now, in nuclear waste, there is no iodine-131, which means it shouldn't be concentrated and stored. It should be diluted and dispersed, like every other such toxin. Our regulations require the opposite. Our regulations, in the name of safety, create the hazard. Our regulations restrict iodine-131 to 0.04 becquerels. You heard me correctly. A becquerel, the disintegration of a single atom. And the regulations are set to be 20 times smaller than that. These regulations were put in place at the behest of the nuclear waste cleanup industry, which makes billions in profit every single year, just at Hanford alone, just to dig up dirt that is already below natural background levels of radiation. This comes at a steep cost. The cost of a misinformed public, the cost of spreading unnecessary fear, the cost of new nuclear development. Ready for another? Let's challenge the accepted safety paradigm too. At Fukushima, only 28 grams of iodine-131 were released. 1 teaspoon worth. And that was from the meltdown of a 3 gigawatts worth of nuclear reactors. I will tell you something now that no nuclear engineer dares to say out loud, fear of social repercussions from their peers, but also that no nuclear engineer has successfully challenged me on. Water-based reactors, via their very physics, are incapable of spreading enough iodine-131 to ever pose a risk to the public in any circumstance. There is no realistic biological pathway to consume a sufficient amount to do harm. That's without any containment dome, any passive safety, any N stamp requirements, or any even inspections. At nuclear conferences across 3 continents, I've offered $10,000 to anyone who can successfully challenge me on that claim. And that offer still stands today. The underlying argument behind all nuclear safety requirements is that there is a disproportionate risk to the public, and that is based on a lie. This is why at Fukushima, no one was hurt from radiation. The public was never at any risk, except by the hands of their own government, and the hazard they induced of evacuation. So we're here to assess small modular reactors, right? Well, the defining attribute of a small modular reactor is 300 megawatts or less. So if the worst case scenario of a large water reactor meltdown, as demonstrated during Fukushima, where there was 10 times as much nuclear material, when every single safety system failed, is that a teaspoon of toxin was released? One must at least consider, do small reactors even need a regulator at all? The first country who will trust their own scientists and reassess radiation protection is going to be the first country who saves the world. Estonia, you are in the perfect position to repeat your past success of internet deployment, this time with an energy revolution. There's only one thing that you have to do to create a thriving nuclear industry here, and then to create an export economy of both electrons and technology, to lead Europe and the rest of the world in climate change action. It is this: do not get tricked into minimizing radiation. You already have a successful environmental regulator. You already have a successful energy regulator. You already have a successful building regulator. All technology needs rules, yes, but all rules need limits too. You have enough health physicists to validate everything that I'm saying and craft meaningful, common-sense licensing pathways as part of the existing government structure. Do just as the US did in the 1960s, when we were the most successful in building our nuclear fleet. In the US, out of the 98 reactors that are still running today, every single one of their designs came from an era with no independent regulator, when radiation was treated just like any other hazard might be. Back then, the time from construction to criticality took on average 4 years. And 26 of those plants from back then, in the 60s, are still running today. Then, there were 30 projects that had already started, but were caught midway through the shift in regulations in the US. They couldn't complete construction, and they have been depriving ratepayers of $400 billion in clean electricity ever since. It killed an industry that was on track to take over 100% of the energy market. Out of those that were caught in the new regulations but did manage to complete construction, 12 years became the new average time. That same plant design went from 4 years to 12 years. We'll compare with specific examples. Point Beach 1 and 2. 1,182 megawatts for only $733 million. That's inflation adjusted. Started in 1968, those were built in just 3 years, and they are still running today. Vogtle Unit 3, around that same power, 1,100 megawatts, will cost over $13 billion and take over a decade to complete. Same power, $733 million versus $13 billion. In Estonia, you are currently regulated like that of our 1960s. Don't let the US pressure you into following our last 50 years worth of mistakes. If you can resist such pressure, on the coast of Vormsi alone, you have enough room to build 60 gigawatts worth of reactors that would generate $26 billion worth of power a year, doubling your GDP, just Vormsi. On the coast of Hioma, you could build another 200 gigawatts. You'd have to build some transmission lines, but you could completely decarbonize Europe and make 57 billion in profit every year. And all you need to do that is keep regulations at what was good enough for the US in the 1960s and is still good enough for those 26 plants today. If you are able to demonstrate independent thought instead of relying on an independent regulator, you will have the most successful nuclear power deployment to ever exist. Julge hunde rind un rasvana. Climate change was first pondered as early as the 1800s. And yet there are still open questions. What are the roles of feedback loops or the ocean? How bad will it be? How fast will it change? Is it much different than the status quo? A world that accepts 3 billion to live in poverty while others accrue so much wealth? I, in fact, encourage a vigorous debate about whether it's even worth slowing growth, slowing human prosperity, and perhaps a futile attempt to stop the inevitable. But what I do not accept is to start with a premise that lets others suffer while we have a choice to take action. Climate change aside, abundant nuclear is a tool to arrest poverty, to eliminate air pollution, to produce food, water, shelter in unlimited quantity. I personally will not rest until this vision is realized. The future is clean. The future is prosperous. The future is atomic. The energy revolution begins now. It is no longer a matter of when, it is a matter of who. Will it be Estonia? Will it be you? Aite. Thank you.
Bret, for that very inspirational speech. Unless you mind, I do have a couple of questions for you. Yes, please. Although I am aware that our questions stand between you and lunch, but please bear with me.
Keep it brief.
Keep it brief, indeed. One of the questions that we've received is, well, I think a lot of the overregulation and a lot of the patterns in our industry are driven by emotions, are driven by fear, and we tend to counteract them or respond to them with facts. So there are two different leagues who don't understand each other's language. How do we make ourselves understood? Because I believe there are rational people and emotional people on both sides.
I have a slightly different take on this. I actually believe that the public, in their fear of nuclear, is acting totally rationally, because we've said every single plant needs $10 billion worth of extra safety equipment than an otherwise standard coal plant. Because we've said they have to be located so far away. Because we've said they have to have missile shields. We've convinced the public they have no choice but to believe that this must be so dangerous. Otherwise, why would we impose, us the experts, the government, why would they put so much extra regulations if it wasn't so dangerous? It's the nuclear industry's fault that people are afraid. They're not acting irrationally. We've done this. And the way to undo this is to do the opposite. Put the nuclear plants right in the middle of the city. Right? You want to convince people that there's no problem there? That's where you put them. Allow people to walk there, touch them, do tours. People won't be afraid then.
Realistically, it might be a little bit difficult to achieve, but we do know that people who live closest to nuclear power plants also show the highest appreciation and support for these nuclear power plants because they have access to information.
Exactly. I mean, it seems challenging, right? When I just said that, what was the reaction? The reaction is, I don't think so, right? But if we are brave, that is what will happen, right? If we are willing to do something that might seem counterintuitive, we will achieve the effect we desire.
Bret, a very practical question. How would Estonia, well, avoid overregulation? What is your top 10 things, top 3 things to do, top 1 thing to do?
I don't know, but I'm going to spend some time here and try to help you guys figure that out. This is too important. This is too important to let slide. I don't know if it's a conversation with the government, sitting down in the room with the Ministry of Environment or Energy or Infrastructure and just having a frank conversation, showing them that same teaspoon that I showed you. It doesn't take a nuclear physicist to come to the same conclusions that I did. I don't have a background in nuclear physics. I just met with the experts and talked to them. I was shocked also to find out that a meltdown of a reactor is actually no big deal, right? Chernobyl, different, graphite, caught on fire, spread things all around. But a meltdown, right? That's just metal melting down. It is no hazard to the public. And if I can understand that, then your regulators can understand that too.
A final question then. You say that nuclear power is the only viable way for carbon capture. And some observant people have pointed out, well, what about photosynthesis? What about natural processes for carbon capture? Have you considered that?
You know, when I started the Energy Impact Center, I didn't know, it wasn't about nuclear, it was about climate change. I got pointed towards nuclear by the experts. The experts showed me the equations. They said, listen, here's the rate at which we need to pull carbon from the air. And if you were to, the first thing I thought, why don't we just plant trees in the Sahara? Well, that seems awesome. More forests, more ecology, great. But they showed me the calculations. And if you planted every square inch of available land with trees, that wouldn't make a dent in the amount of carbon that we have to pull out of the air. And those trees can only pull it out for 20 years as well. So the math just doesn't support natural biological processes. We've burned a lot of carbon over the last couple hundred years. We burned the natural processes 100 million years worth of carbon capture in just the last couple hundred years. This is going to take technology, it's going to take ingenuity, and it's going to take bravery to pull us out of this mess. But I'm sure you guys can do it.
Thank you, Bret.
Thank you.